Hey folks, this is Catherine, and today we are going to make this hat. This hat is sometimes called a fillet, it's sometimes called a torque hat, it's sometimes called a coffee filter hat because its resemblance to such a thing. But it's a fairly common accessory in the late 13th going into the early 14th century. So we're going to talk about making a pattern and some quick overview on constructing it, but it's a nice simple accessory. I'm doing it in white because I didn't have a white one, but you can also see them in colors. They can be beaded, they can be embellished, but this is what we're going to be working on today. So let's get started. Before you make your hat, of course, you want to make a pattern. I like to use brown paper for patterning, or in this case, leftover wrapping paper. But you want to measure your head, figure out what size you want, give yourself a little extra, like a quarter inch extra, because if you make it exactly to your head, it's going to be too snug once you add the thickness of the fabric. You want to draw a curve that is less than half a circle. If you draw like a full circle or a full oval and then add brim, it's going to lay flat. And because you want this to stick up a little, you want to put a little bit, just less than a full circle, anywhere between a quarter of a circle and a half circle. Bigger than a half circle, it's going to be too floppy. If you just draw it straight at the bottom, you're not going to get a lot of flare, and you want that little bit of flare out to the top edge. So the bottom edge is my circumference as I want it to fit, plus like a quarter inch, and then my upper line is around an inch and a half longer. From that, I measured out 5/8 of an inch all along and just put little dots to mark that 5/8 of an inch. On the pattern, you can see I drew the full size of the hat, but I put a line halfway because most likely when I cut this out, I'm going to cut it on the fold. That little line with the arrows indicates cut here on fold. So I'll actually fold the pattern in half, set it on folded fabric when I'm cutting it out, rather than laying out the whole piece. But when I'm making my own patterns, I like having the option of either having the half piece or unfolding it so I can lay it out more easily. I don't always include seam allowances on my pattern. In this case I did. I added my 5/8, and so I also wrote on my pattern that there is 5/8 as a seam allowance included. I put what the piece is, I put the date. My head's not going to change a lot of size, but if you are patterning a dress or a bodice or something around your squishier parts, it's good to know the date because we all kind of go up and down in size. So that kind of gives you a reference. So once you've got it kind of marked out with that nice arc, longer arc, you might do a couple test patterns and try them out on your head to see that you like the shape, you like the flare, you like the fit. That's why you use cheap paper rather than fancy stuff. You can then cut this out when you're cutting. Remember, use paper scissors, not fabric scissors. This will destroy your fabric scissors. So once you've got a nice pattern, whether you're drafting it yourself, or if you are tracing a hat that you like, or if you are copying it out of a book, I really do recommend From the Neck Up, which is a big collection of hat patterns, and they're all graphed out on 1-inch squares. So if you're not confident about drafting a pattern, that's a really great place to start. They don't just have these hats, they have a ton of hoods and liripipes and hennons and all these other great medieval hats and hoods. So it's a great book. But once you've got your paper pattern, we're going to cut it out, and then we're going to use that to cut out our fabric. So now that we've made our pattern, on the paper. We've got it all labeled. As you can see, it's around 1/4 of a circle. The next step is going to be cutting it out. I've decided that I want to make a white hat because I've got a colored one, but a lot of the ones that you see in the artwork are white. And so from that pattern, I am going to cut it out 3 times. I'm going to cut it out twice from my fabric, and I'm going to cut it out once from interfacing. The interfacing is a cheat. It's not historically accurate, but it does help stiffen the fabric. In period, a stiff fillet like this would probably be stiffened with starch, and it's annoying to starch, and you've got it. This is easier. So here you can see my piece. I actually cut it on the fold, just because it's a little less cutting. This piece, and you can see it also hangs a bit stiffer. This one, you can see, I did not cut my interfacing on the fold, but I did cut it in 2 pieces. More efficient use of fabric, but it's been interfaced. And I've already fused the interfacing to the linen. So I have 2 hat bodies. I've also decided that I want to add a little ruffle at the top of the hat, and so I cut a 2-inch wide. I just used what I had. It's a little bit under 2 yards, 2 inches by under 2 yards strip of linen. All of this is the same linen. It's scrap from what I used for my veils. So it's 3.5 ounce pure linen in bleached white. A heavier linen would be nice, but since I'm using stuff that's around the house, this is what I had. I know it's going to match. The interfacing will help. A heavier fabric might not need the interfacing, but this is kind of floppy. So, now that I've cut out my 2 bodies and my ruffle, I'm going to start with sewing. Now, you can sew this by machine. You could do the entire thing by machine. You could sew it by hand. That's going to be up to you. But, and I'm going to say I'm not filming up at the machine. It's hot in my attic. So, but the first thing we're going to do for sewing is we are going to take the bodies and we are going to stitch them along what's going to be the center back. With the pattern, I cut this with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. You can cut a bigger one, a smaller one, that's up to you, but I default to 5/8 because it's a commercial seam allowance and it's easy to remember. You're going to sew both of the bodies up that center back. I'm going to come back in another section after I've gotten these sewn, and we're going to talk about attaching the ruffle. So that's where we are right now. So now I have taken my 2 hat bodies and I have sewn them into little fabric donuts. So they have their seams pressed open at the center back. Next, I am going to add my ruffle, and that's part of why I am doing it this way, so that my ruffle has a nice continuous edge. You can, like, sew them together, top and bottom, turn them, and then finish the inside, but I'm doing it in a way that I get a nice continuous ruffle at the top. I did stay stitch these. Stay stitching, you are stitching at a nice long stitch length through just one layer of fabric. You're not stitching anything to anything, but stay stitching stabilizes the fabric. This is really important for fabric that is cut on an angle to the weave, which is what we call the bias. It tends to be stretchy, and as you manipulate it and play with it, because it's stretchy on the bias, because normal fabric, you've got your straight and your cross, right? So up and down, and they make little boxes. Well, the fabric is really stretchy from corner to corner of those boxes, that diagonal. You don't want it to become distorted, and so stay stitching will help stabilize that. And so here I have my interfaced piece, that has been seamed, and I have my ruffle. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start pinning this ruffle to the hat before I sew it on. And I like to start at the seam just because it's a nice place to start. And when I go to pin it on, I want my 2-inch strip has been folded in half. I want to take that folded edge and I want to put the folded edge towards the bottom. I'm sewing it to the top half, but I want it towards the bottom on the right side of the fabric. Because when we turn the hat, when it's stitched on, what's going to happen is it's going to flip up. And so your ruffle will be sticking out the top of the seam. So we want the ruffle to be pinned down. And I am just going to basically put in the pleats by hand. I'm just going to eyeball them and put them in. And so I'm going to pin it at the start, and then I am going to make around a little 1/4-inch pleat and throw in a pin. Then these are just little knife pleats. I'm not doing anything fancy. I'm not doing box pleats. You can, if you want, run a gathering stitch along your strip and then pin it to fit another pleat. You could do box pleats. You can cut your strip on a circle rather than cutting it straight, which is not very fabric efficient, but will give you a little ruffly shape. But I'm just going to keep making little knife pleats by eye, all in the same. So here you can see my little collection of knife pleats, all in the same direction, going all around the hat. So I'm going to be back after I'm done pinning all of these. So I've been pleating and pleating and pleating, and this is what I got. So I need to cut another couple inches of strip and finish pleating, but you can see it's just going the whole way around in a bunch of little knife pleats. So I'm going to get that extra piece of fabric because, yes, I could unpin this whole thing, adjust it, and make it fit. Nobody got time for that. So now that I've added an extra strip, you can see I have the ruffle pleated all the way around the top. The next step, and again you can do this by hand or machine, is to baste, that is, use nice long stitches and attach the ruffle to the hat body. On a machine you're going to do that with a number 5 or whatever your biggest stitch is. By hand you can just do a quick running stitch. Either one is fine, but that way you don't have 50 million pins in your hat when you're trying to put your layers together. As said, you could have also gathered, but I did a bunch of pleats. So once you baste this, then we're going to be putting the inside and the lining, the outside and the lining, together. So go baste your ruffle, or skip it if you don't have a ruffle. So I finished pinning all of my ruffle, and I have basted the ruffle to the hat body. Again, to the right side of the hat body, because my seam allowance is on the inside. I don't want that on the outside. Once you've got the ruffle in place, we're going to put the two hat bodies together. We want to put them right side together. So we're going to take this body and the lining, and making sure right side's together, that means the wrong side's going to be out. We are going to just, well, find the seam, because you want to match up your seams. And you're going to put that one right over the other body. And you want to line it up, make sure it matches up, that everything is nice and even. And then you are going to pin it together on that top edge all the way around, leaving the bottom edge open, because there is no good way to turn this. It turns into a weird donut or some kind of weird infinity tube. So we are just going to stitch that top edge. And you'll see that once we have that stitched and we flip, the ruffles are going to pop right out along the top and give you a nice goffered top edge. So you want to put right sides together, you want to pin all along the top edge, and you want to stitch that either by machine or by hand. As said, I'm using a 5/8 seam allowance. So I've sewn my layers together, and I have already pressed the seam allowance down. I'm going to press it again after I turn it, but it's nice to press it again. Now here you see the tops of all of those pleats that I made. Before I turn it for real, I'm going to go in with scissors and cut these down to between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch to reduce bulk in the hat. I think that these seam allowances should be okay. So once you've done it, you're going to turn, you're going to clip, then you're going to turn so that your right sides are out. Now it's kind of a funky looking tube. And you're going to flip the lining in. And now, see, now it's starting to look like a hat, right? And so here's my seam at the center back. And there's going to be more pressing, because there's always more pressing in sewing, to really get that edge to stay down so that the ruffle can be really nice. And then we are going to take those two bottom edges and we need to sew them together. Now, if you really want nice, close, high inspection, you're going to do this bottom edge by hand, either with a slip or ladder stitch. You could do a decorative stitch, you could bind it. I'm going to top stitch. I'm going to top stitch in white, just like I'm going to top stitch this edge here in white, because I like to machine wash things, and in my experience the top stitching is going to help it keep its shape after a beating in the washing machine. So with this bottom edge, remember we stay stitched that edge, and you cannot at all see the stay stitching on the camera. So there's stitching on each of these layers 5/8 of an inch from the bottom edge. And because this is cut at an angle, because it's cut at a curve, the circumference here at the bottom edge is a smaller circumference than it is here at 5/8, or where it will be an additional 5/8 when this is flipped up inside, because it's going from somewhere smaller to somewhere bigger. If I just flipped these in as it stands, what will happen is it's going to kind of pull and wrinkle and buckle, because the smaller circumference is going to pull. So what you have to do before you flip this seam allowance up is you need to clip your seam allowance. And you want to clip it every inch or so, and you want to clip it right up to your stay stitching, but not through your stay stitching. Don't clip those stitches. And that stay stitching, in addition to, you know, keeping things from stretching, will also stop the little clip from going any further. It's hit a stitch and it's like a little stop sign, so the clip isn't going to spread and like rip up your fabric. But that clipping will allow this edge to spread so it can be the same size as where it's flipping up to. So what we're going to do is we are going to clip all of this, flip it, do lots of pressing. We're also going to clip out our extra bulk here. So I'm going to show you this with it all set up for the next step. Addendum. When you're clipping, and you can see that I've been clipping so this can spread out, right? My seam allowance can spread out when it flips. You want to make sure that you get good scissors for clipping seam allowance. I've got a set of points, which I love to bits and pieces, but little sharp embroidery scissors are also really good for this. But what is most important with your scissors is that you have scissors that cut all the way to the point. What you don't want to have happen is you are clipping away and you're just looking and trying to stop at a certain point. Instead, if you know that your scissors cut all the way to the point, when you start your clip, you just make sure your point lines up with your stay stitching and then just clip to the edge. You don't have to, be careful, you can just clip. So make sure you've got the right kind of scissors for trimming your seam allowances. Almost there. So I have folded up the edges and pinned. At this point, you want to stitch these two edges together. The advantage of hand stitching is if there's any discrepancies in size, you can sort of ease it a little more subtly with hand stitching. The advantage of top stitching is it's fast. And since I want to get this done, I like to, machine wash and abuse things, I'm going to top stitch it. But as said, a hand stitch will give you a beautiful, invisible bottom edge. So we are almost there. And here is the finished hat with a veil and barbette. You can also wear this little Manesse Codex torque with your hair loose. You see it a lot with loose curls, still with the barbette. You also see it with a crispinet or hairnet to contain your hair. I've got really straight hair. It looks bad in a snood, so I like to wear it with veils. But as you can see, I just top stitched that edge, and I've got a nice little white washable ruffled torque to work on my late 13th, early 14th century impression. So if you've got any questions, leave them in the comments. If you're curious about how I put on my veils, check out my other videos. And that's it. Thanks.